Welcome. I'm impressed to see so many people out so bright and early on a rainy day. We are trying something of an experiment by creating this very large panel. As the day goes on, we will find a way to get questions from the audience brought up. But the rules of engagement that I've explained to all the panelists are they've been instructed to speak for 5 minutes or so. And we have some opening comments, and then I would welcome them to converse among themselves. And from then on, any participant here on the panel is free to join the conversation. This is in part because a lot of our themes today bleed one into another, and they don't, you can analytically separate them, but issues of race and migration and peoplehood, for example, form a cluster of serious problems, which we'll be discussing as the day goes on. And many of our panelists have things to say and even expertise in areas they're not specifically leading us off with. The panelists, these microphones only function if you turn them on, and a little red light comes on. So it really is like the Security Council, as Bill Kristol said, which makes us sound very august. The other thing I would say, the moderators are going to be me and Helena, Rosenblatt, and Bob Boyer's here. And there are three of us in part to keep an eye on all of you. And if you want to say something, if you raise your hand, we'll put you in a queue. But if it's something that's directly responding to something that's been said, make a timeout sign. Now, I'm told that they do this, what is Liberty Fund? Liberty Fund. Well, I'm doing the timeout, but it's libertarian endorsed. That's the point. Sorry. And the other thing I would say is all of you were given a flyer when you walked in, which has fairly extensive, although short, biographies of all the participants. And we're not doing long introductions. If you're curious about these, the accomplishments of our very accomplished panelists, you can look in your flyer, because we want to get down to business and talk. So without further ado, I turn the floor over to Yuval Levin.
All right, good morning. Thank you very much. Very grateful for the three of you for organizing this and getting us together, talk about these critical questions, and for giving us a role in celebrating the centennial of the New School, one of America's great intellectual institutions. I'm a little bit less grateful to be asked to speak first, and it's a challenge to kick us off, but I thought that I would do that by using this as an excuse to start off with a bit of Abraham Lincoln, because I think that Lincoln should be on our minds if we're going to talk about equality in American life. And there's a particular bit of Lincoln that can help us raise, I think, one of the challenges in thinking about equality as a contested question in American life. In June of 1857, right after the Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision, Abraham Lincoln gave an extraordinary speech in Chicago, extraordinary in many ways and really worth your while. But among other things, he tried to lay out what he thought the signers of the Declaration of Independence meant when they signed their name to the assertion that all men are created equal. And he said this, I'm going to quote a very brief paragraph. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all and revered by all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere. It's a little passage that highlights the force and the depth of the principle of equality in our national life, but it also highlights the breadth of the principle. Equality is how we think about almost everything, so that while egalitarianism is certainly a contested question in our politics, it's contested in a particular way. The appeal of equality in our politics is such that almost every party to every dispute claims it for itself and insists that it is really the party of equality, properly understood, so that our politics is very often an arena of competing claims of equality and competing understandings of its meanings and its practical implications. We don't really argue about whether egalitarianism is good or bad, generally speaking. We argue about what it means and who embodies it best. We use equality as a name for whatever we want to advance, or as a framework for thinking about what we value. We use it as another word for justice, as another word for freedom, for democracy, for fairness. You find arguments from equality on both sides of the abortion debate, even on both sides of the immigration debate, really on both sides of almost every contentious debate, truly contentious debate in our politics. And we can also see this dynamic in the tension in our politics between democracy and liberalism, which is another theme of this conference. In some respects, the idea of egalitarianism is a framework for that tension between democracy and liberalism. Democracy, as a practical matter, often comes down to a commitment to majority rule, and so is about empowering majorities to govern. Liberalism, as a practical matter, often comes down to a commitment to individual rights, and so is often about protecting minorities from majority tyranny or oppression. So while democracy empowers majorities, liberalism constrains majorities, and both of them in modern politics often do that in the name of equality. The debate between them is a debate about how to apply our commitment to equality, or what egalitarianism really means. The almost universality of this appeal to equality can be a problem for us. It's confusing. It leaves us making arguments that aren't very precise. If equality means everything, then maybe it doesn't mean anything. But I think that on the whole, it is an enormous boon to our politics, a great benefit for us. It means that we start from a broad shared commitment and then argue about what it should involve. And it means that we can set some moral boundaries on our politics. Equality can mean a lot of things, but there are some things that it can't mean. And so there are some things that an egalitarian politics does exclude. It can't mean racism. It can't mean an absolutely abject elitism or an outright rejection of human rights. These kinds of views obviously exist in our politics, but they start at a disadvantage because they can't really claim, even pretend to be egalitarian. Finally, I'd say that we are also fortunate to have equality as the maxim of our politics because it can't be perfectly achieved, as that quote from Lincoln suggests. That it isn't entirely achievable helps to keep our ideal in the future rather than in the past. America is always judging itself against what it ought to be, which is a helpful way to live, even if it's not always a peaceful way to live. These are obviously very general points to start with, but I think that it's worth noticing that when we argue about equality in our politics, we are generally arguing not about whether, but about how. And that in itself can be a strong start for a democratic politics. Thanks.
So, can everybody hear me? So I'd also like to just begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's you know, this is something I've been really looking forward to, and it's a pleasure to be here. And also, you know, wanted to just celebrate the new school and its 100th anniversary as well. So for my comments, what I'd like to focus on is the question of equality for who. So all of the states, really, that we refer to as liberal democracies are products of a world system forged through European empire. And that fact has a very particular meaning for the US. So if we went back 100 years ago in the United States, there would be ways in which Americans, and here I really mean European Americans, would have understood the things that are consistent and inconsistent between the American project and the European states on the continent. So the thing that was consistent was that the US was a white outpost in the non-white world. The thing that was supposed to be inconsistent was that Americans had solved the problem of feudalism. In other words, they'd created a society that was class egalitarian and that had internally democratic principles of self-government to a degree yet unknown in human history. That was sort of the mythology and the self-understanding. But what's key was that these two were not just parallel facts, but were understood as intricately, perhaps even inextricably bound together. The condition for the latter was the former. And indeed, the story, you could say, of what amounted to internal American egalitarianism has historically been the story of maintaining harsh modes of subordination over communities that are understood as outsiders in various ways. So you have rich internal accounts of freedom and self-rule, but those internal accounts are bound to external projects, either of land expropriation or coerced labor. So how is it that these two things were supposed to be interconnected? The thought was, well, the reason why you have class equality in the US is because you have access to land that provides a degree of social mobility, and then you have a labor supply that's been racialized that can engage in the hard forms of work that are necessary for the functioning of an economy, but that are incompatible with what you might think of as free labor in the 19th century, or just a kind of emancipated and ethical experience of life. And at various moments in American history, the way in which groups have been able to enjoy greater forms of internal inequality has been by essentially policing this divide and hardening it. So you can tell the story of the late 17th century, this is Edmund Morgan's American Slavery, American Freedom, of white populism as bound to the imposition of lifetime enslavement and bondage for African Americans. You can tell the high tide of the white republic in Jacksonian democracy, where it's universal suffrage for white men, but through hardening these color lines, but not just the color lines and native expropriation, also ensuring that white men can claim a kind of legitimacy to participate in politics even though they don't own property because they're in control of a household, and so have certain kinds of paternal and patriarchal prerogatives over women. This is the same period where you also see the elimination of voting rights for women that had existed on the margins in various places in the late 18th and early 19th century. And you can tell this story all the way down to the present, where in a sense, one of the most profound languages of subordination in the US is a language of egalitarianism. So take Scalia. When Scalia, in oral argument in Shelby County, argues against the constitutionality of Section 4 and Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, what does he say? He says that the Voting Rights Act is a racial entitlement. He is making an argument through the language of equality for the subordination of communities that essentially are not being presented as part of the body politic, or that the condition for their inclusion is understood as a violation of the internal principles of equality. And I'd say you can make a very similar argument about the language of policing the border. The imperative of the border in the present is a language of equality that's being used to subordinate a large percentage of people that are subject to the power of the US. And in a way, the problem for the present is that if you have an American project that's part of a world system that was forged through empire and that is itself embedded in a history of both global hegemony but also internal colonization, then the question is, can you actually create a society in which all of those that are subject to the power of the state actually enjoy something like equal and effective freedom? And that requires not just thinking about egalitarianism, but thinking about the capacity to universalize the internal principles of equality and make them broadly accessible to those that have historically been the condition for the freedom of others. And so to say that egalitarianism is a contested principle is to highlight the fact that really we have never lived in liberal democracies. We live in societies with illiberal foundations where the condition of freedom for some is the subordination of others.
Okay, well, I'm also grateful for this opportunity to speak here. I think I want to be a little bit of the skunk at the party. This is a conference about ideas and how ideas shape our societies. And I guess I want to say that I think that the importance of these kinds of ideas is much overrated. At least in this group. That I mean, it's nice. There's a great story that sees the political struggles that we face as a conflict of philosophical principles. That sees us, to be crude, but I think this is where it's Rawls versus Nozick, and are we a Rawlsian or a Nozickian principled society? The reality is that neither politicians nor voters are philosophers, and that what actually goes on in the choices we make has very little to do with these abstract principles. I would say I think that there are a fair number of voters, some politicians who are instinctively kind of Rawlsians, who do have a little bit of they've never heard of the veil of ignorance, but they do have some sense of there, but for the grace of God go I, and view a little bit, what that could have been me. And there's also a pretty substantial contingent of anti-Rawlsians who say, you know, I am who I am and I've got mine, and maybe some other people who look like me should get it. But to a first approximation, there are no Zickians. The libertarian idea that we should have a social liberalism, but not egalitarian income redistributing government policies is defensible, it's interesting, it has, as best we can tell, it's maybe 4% of the electorate actually buys into that. It's just not something that wins elections. So that in practice, the only way that, and sorry, to take another step, that overwhelmingly people do support a fair bit of redistributive policies. The countervailing force is some form of social illiberalism. And in the US context, that overwhelmingly means race. And if, as far as I'm concerned, the interesting question about US political destiny is, I mean, there's the question of how it'll turn out, but the question about I've written about this, and you know, everybody knows what I think about everything, but the interesting empty box to me is why we don't have a socially illiberal, economically free market space in our political life. You might that could be there. It's we could the idea, the principle of a Herrenvolk welfare state is something that could make sense and would probably have the support of a quite substantial part of the electorate, but our political system doesn't seem to want to go there. We in fact have a choice between social liberalism and an extensive welfare state, or social illiberalism and a restrictive, limited welfare state. I'm not sure that basically, just to come back to my original point here, that interpreting what's going on here in terms of a struggle of ideas just doesn't seem to me to bear very much relationship to reality. It's possible to have good faith debates about politics. It is possible to have, and about policies. And in some places we do have them, but none of the big disputes that roil the United States right now are in fact good faith debates. There is not the people who argue for, I mean, maybe there are some naive people who actually think they can sell a libertarian agenda in America, and I wish them the best of luck. But that's not what actually gives any of these ideas force. They're all given force because they serve interest groups, and because they're essentially a cover for what is actually a much more self-interested, harsher, not very honest agenda.
Thanks, Jim and Helena, for writing those two amazing books that generated this conference. I've probably given 100 economics lectures in this very room, so this might sound like 101st. Because I want to switch from this concept of liberal democracy to the logical extension of that project, which is economic democracy. And economic democracy is embodied what we call a welfare state. And I want to say here that there is no future of democracy or capitalism without the welfare state. We're not going to go beyond the welfare state. The welfare state is needed to ameliorate risk and to save capitalism from itself. Let's start with welfare state 1.0 about 75 years ago in the United States. All started at the passage of the Social Security Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, the Unemployment Insurance, AFDC, and labor rights, trade union rights. It's founded, the ideas that founded that, and maybe Paul will agree or disagree, on really what was becoming standard Keynesian models, that capitalism was going to fail at generating enough aggregate demand, and you needed the state to come in to provide the public good of stabilization and expansion of GDP when it was needed. Now, in welfare state 1.0, there was no adjustment for environmental degradation, and there was no adjustment for unpaid female care labor. Welfare state 1.0 did redistribute income, but it was between workers, not so much between capital and labor, and that was done through the expansion of social insurance. The labor of deserving recipients, single mothers, the superannuated worker, and of children with the rise of compulsory secondary education was partly decommodified. The idea of an expansive welfare state was to decommodify some people's labor so they didn't have to sell it on the open market to get by. And the incipient civil rights movement was aimed to economically enfranchise Black men into a formal labor market. The welfare state also extended to the workplace with an explicit aim of countervailing the power of capital and to provide economic rights. The firms, American firms in the post-war period, tolerated a national Treaty of Detroit. And that treaty paid workers for their productivity and expanded paid time off. The labor movement brought you the weekend, it brought you the concept of retirement, it brought you holidays and sick pay. Welfare State 1.0 protected workplace democracy. Unions could negotiate a adjudication process, a fairness process, a justice process at work. And labor standards and regulated wages became the non-union workers' union contract. How was it paid for? How was this welfare state paid for? In some ways, it was paid for with shared rents, but mostly progressive tax rates. Now, Welfare State 2.0 started in the 1970s. It took on the task of recommodifying labor. Old people were supposed to work. Single mothers were supposed to work. The idea of Milton Friedman was that we would have universal basic income for a small section of the deserving poor, but it would replace the welfare state. Universal basic income would replace the welfare state. And the progressive tax system was squeezed by what is uniquely American, which is a hidden welfare state. And make no mistake, to count Social Security, Medicare, TANF, food stamps as the welfare state. There's a $2 trillion welfare state filled with entitlements for business, for oil depletion allowances, for investment tax credits, for preferential capital gains. It goes on and on. In fact, the Green Book from the government that lists this is about this thick. And it creeps into the tax code. It makes the system less progressive, and it's an entitlement that never is voted on year after year. Higher income people also got a hidden welfare state through deductions for their mortgages, for their retirement plan contributions, for their health care. In this period of time, we see the expansion of something called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Everybody knows what it is. It's a payment through the tax system, looks a lot like Milton Friedman's idea, to low-wage workers. Now, it does raise the incomes of eligible workers. Single mothers are getting more income when they work in low-wage jobs, but 70% of that benefit goes to low-wage employers. They love it. It actually subsidizes the miserable wages of their workers. Now, let's look ahead at what 3.0, Welfare State 3.0 might look like. So this is aspirational. It's actually not based on polls, but here I go. My vision of Welfare State 3.0 takes an aim at patriarchy. It finally makes care work pay. And the only way to do that is to expand the welfare state to make personal care workers, home health care workers, the largest category of jobs in the next 10 years. 1 million out of 11 million new jobs will be in this area. The only way for them to be high quality, high pay will be to be government workers. Welfare State 3.0 is pro-growth. It's not about redistribution, but the growth will be judged as the World Bank is judging. It will be judged by its ability to bring up the GDP of the bottom half faster than average GDP. It also should adjust for climate impact. Welfare State 3.0 will have to protect capitalism against the crushing likelihood of overproduction. It will boost and stabilize aggregate demand and business cycles. This is especially important as income and also political power shifts to the top 1% and the top 0.01%. They're the class that's likely to hoard, and they don't spend nationally. Is it affordable? Well, let's set aside healthcare costs. That's very high, but it's not a job of the welfare state to control the pricing in that industry. Social Security, a big one, it's almost $1 trillion in the next couple of years per year, is eminently affordable. You can raise the earnings cap, tweak the payroll tax, and you're good to go. Social Security is blessed with our nation that has an underappreciated characteristic. We actually pay our taxes. Our tax base is quite high, and we also have a young population. GDP spent for Social Security is 4.9% now. It will be 5.9% in 40 years. Compare that to the OECD, where it will go up to 9%, to France, will go up to 15%. UBI does not belong in my vision of welfare state 3.0. A job guarantee, though, does. Last, we will see a welfare state 3.0 where government is bigger, where more goods and services produced will be from the public sector, because these are public goods that we're dying for. We need infrastructure, we need good care work, et cetera, not more private goods. And in closing, which John Kenneth Grauber said gave hope to the audience, if I were at a party with people from conservative think tanks, we would probably agree that the welfare state should be pro-growth. We may not agree that it should be bottoms-up growth. We would agree that the welfare state should be paid for. I'm not a modern monetary theorist. And I would agree, I would probably do a little teaching, that most economists, though, agree that an advanced capitalist economy such as ours needs chronic government debt to keep labor markets tight. We would disagree that social mobility was somehow in conflict with economic security. A poor kid can't be lifted into college without government housing, food stamps, and their asthma treated by Medicaid. I would not agree that Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security are failures. I would probably disagree with them that paid time off after a lifetime of work is a hallmark of a civilized society, and so is a strong welfare state. And now?
So anybody of our first four speakers have anything to say at this juncture?
Can I just speak up for the honor of the EITC, which is a lot better than Teresa just portrayed it, and especially in tandem with the minimum wage. Actually, the EITC actually the EITC and food stamps together are our crucial anti-poverty programs in America today, and I would not. I think we need to be nice to them.
Well, first of all, I very much agree about the ATC, and I agree more than that. I think what Paul said is very important for us to keep in mind. There's a way in which if this was a convention of tomato growers, we would start by saying American life is really about tomatoes, and Abraham Lincoln really loved tomatoes. But I also do want to stand up for the honor of political theory just a little bit, because theory really is not, it doesn't claim for itself that it is the source of practice, that people act because they have these sophisticated visions, philosophical visions that motivate them. Theory, at least as much, is a way of understanding practice and trying to make sense of it in ways that assume that it can be coherent and is coherent. And I would just say the options we have for thinking about how to understand American life as a function of differing pursuits of the good are not just Nozick and Rawls, they're not just radical individual libertarianism or individualist progressivism. The theories that would do a better job of explaining American life, I think, are more communitarian theories that have more room both for conservatism and for progressivism, and that speak a little more to the ways we actually live. We're not very good as Americans at actually talking about ourselves in terms of those theories, and I do think that the theories we have of American life are much thinner and shallower than the realities of American life. But that's not an argument for not trying to understand some of the forces that act in our politics as functions of people acting on different ways of thinking about the good, including the social good. Because generally speaking, people do get out of bed in the morning to try to do some good, and not just for themselves. And ultimately, when we try to think about our society in those ways, there is something to learn from that. But you're right, it's not everything. There certainly is also an important place for understanding people's interests and the ways in which they pursue ways of being and living and doing that are not best explained by these kinds of philosophies. But there is something to be learned about ourselves by trying to understand the good we're trying to achieve.
Well, actually, you've all said a lot of what I wanted to say, which is that I think it's actually really important to be self-conscious about the political struggles that we find ourselves engaged in. Because if we just treat it as, interest group bargaining that's taking place on the ground, then you're stuck in a kind of, eternal return where you're not actually able to conceive of what would be the conditions to transform the political reality we face. And one way where I think this is then not just a defense of philosophy, it's a defense of history, is that, Paul noted this strange fact that a combination of economic populism and white nationalism seems to be the thing that hasn't been present on the table. And I would just say that, maybe polemically, you could make an argument that throughout much of American history, precisely that combination was the most powerful political ideology in the country. Like, you could make an argument that that's a theme that links Jefferson to Jackson to, Father Coughlin to Wallace. And so the question isn't, why has it not appeared? It's, well, why is it over the last, let's say, half century, it retreated as the defining form of American politics? And that, to me, is an historically specific story about the Cold War and the kinds of political combinations that the Cold War suppressed and the ways in which it made explicit white supremacy and white nationalism a kind of global eyesore. It has to do with the particularities of the labor movement and the labor movement's efforts to unionize in the South and the ways in which that transformed views about economic liberalism and its potential connections with racial equality and inegalitarianism. But maybe then that means that the moment we're living in is precisely one in which those combinations are back on the table. And that's one lesson of the 2016 Republican primary. There was no popular support for Paul Ryan. There was a lot of support for Herrenvolk politics combined with economic populism.
Just an observation. There's a lot of that. I think that is worth how pure the white populism, whites-only populism really was is an interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that. But I just want to say what's remarkable to me about this discussion so far is how American it is. We haven't talked, I don't think another country has been mentioned once. And I teach a course at the GC on economics of the welfare state. And which is a fun thing to do because it's a very international class and it's a very international subject. We have all of these advanced countries which are highly competent, technologically more or less the same, but have made different choices. And so and one of the things about all of these issues is that we have a huge range of evidence, not just from our own history, but from the different things that different countries do. And by the way, one of the lessons, sort of meta lessons that I take from all of that stuff is that it's not that there are countries that do everything right and countries that do everything wrong, that there's enormous specificity, that there's a path dependence. You happen to make choices and then you end up with a good or a bad way of dealing with particular things. So Social Security in the United States is a very effective, well-run, low-cost system. It's something that other countries aspire to. U.S. healthcare is a total mess, and France is kind of the reverse: a disastrous retirement system and a mysteriously effective healthcare system. And so we should definitely not only be talking about our own history here.
Federico.
I wanted to be provocative, but not to provoke Paul Krugman. Let me say that I've argued here that in order to have economic democracy, we're going to have a much bigger government, right? Good enough. I also want to acknowledge that people do get up in the morning and they want to do good, but the market requires them to do well. They will use their economic power to write rules, to influence the democracy, to do well by their shareholders and by their families. I also am concerned about white populism. We did a careful analysis of the voting patterns of the areas that were Obama, Trump, especially in UAW and the United Auto Workers and the steel workers. And what we found, those were the areas that had fallen the fastest. They were above average in Reagan's time in terms of the nation. They had fallen to about average with Bush and Clinton. And even though Obama's auto bailout made it a little bit better, they fell below average of the country all during the Obama years. So if we don't take into account the welfare state and economic democracy, you are going to pave the path to white populism.
Yes, I wanted to return to this point made by Paul Krugman on the issue of why are we talking about America to understand America. I mean, because it's way, when I came to this country from Argentina, I mean, I was already working on fascism and populism, and I was told all the time, what you are doing is very interesting to understand your little country out there, but has nothing to do with the US. And I heard this, I mean, and do we need really Trump to understand that the US now really looks like the rest? And then historically, when you go back both to American history and the history of the world, you see so many connections. So, I mean, as an expert on Peronism, I feel I can see a lot of, a lot of those issues in Trumpism. And the question then is why the problem itself becomes this self-centered notion of America being different. I mean, to people outside of the US, this doesn't look, this looks sometimes like a provincial discussion. And then the question is, of course, why the US shares, I mean, I would just like to say this and I'll shut up, but that why the US shares this particular crisis of representation now than before, if there is always a crisis of representation in democracy, in the sense that always people that vote get frustrated by the fact that their representatives do not look or think or are like them. Now you have, like in the US Congress, for example, a bunch of millionaires that really do not represent America at large. Now, the weird response, and it's not the first time that this happens, the weird response by the American electorate was to vote for a billionaire rather than have all these bunch of millionaire representatives. And that is part of the problem. But the question is really here why there is a problem here in the sense of people looking for representatives that are more like them.
I agree. Our politics is, to a great extent, a knife fight among competing interest groups, and electoral politics often is another arena for that knife fight, given the tremendous amounts of corporate money that go into our elections. But I disagree with Paul Krugman. I think voters are philosophers. Most of them are bad philosophers and ill-informed philosophers. But if you ask someone, why did you vote the way you did, you will get an earful. I mean, you will get downloaded, just all too often a pretty incoherent and disjointed and often terrifying explanation of why they voted why they did. But this is the individual trying to make sense of their world. And I think most of us are trying to make sense of our world, and we're grasping for authentic language, authentic ideas that will help us do that. And so I think that's part of our job, the writers and thinkers and the teachers, is to give people the tools to think in a constructive way about our politics and our world. And so I think, these, I did get a little restless last night when we dwelled on Athens and Sparta, although I love dwelling on that stuff. But it's important to go to the roots of things and to try, I mean, the truth is in there somewhere, and justice is in there somewhere, and I think people are searching for it, grasping for it, and, you know, it's our job as, you know, to the extent that we're, you know, genuinely in good faith engaged in trying to figure out what's good and right about America and trying to get there. I mean, we need to be pushing those ideas and that discussion.
Paul, do you want to respond? I think you've been accused of being a vulgar Marxist.
Yeah. No, I mean, people have, I don't think people are purely their self-interest. I think most people do, at least to some extent, try to do good. Whether they actually have philosophical concepts, I think political scientists would tell us that mostly people decide on a tribe, and then they invent reasons for why they support the tribe. That there's not a whole lot of actual. The reasoning is determined by the end product, not by the steps along the way. But sure, and I just can't help. You know, you have to. If you ask people why they voted, why they did it's because Hillary's running a sex ring out of a pizza shop. You know, there's a lot of scary stuff in terms of if you actually listen to why people say they voted for things. But maybe I'm just leaning too hard because this is such a rarefied group compared with what actually goes out there, and even in the world of policy dispute that I'm part of.
Yes, someone urged that we bring in the international dimension. I wanted to say something about that. I would say, first of all, that the weakening of liberal democracy, rise of populism, and so on, is a global phenomenon that preceded Donald Trump and the particular problems in the United States right now. And I would also say it's not a problem arising from specific features of the welfare state, which differ from country to country. Though I would say all advanced capitalist democracies have welfare states. And the traditional left-right division in liberal democracies has been around the margins of that. Do we adopt this program? Do we cut back the size of the welfare state and so on? But that seems to me still an important debate, but an old debate. It's not what the cutting-edge problems of today are about, and that's the reason why the center-left and center-right parties in so many European and Latin American countries that have lived off these issues are just losing support at an astonishing rate. So I'm not denying the importance of these discussions of welfare state issues, but I don't think they get to the heart of the problem that we're facing right now.
Thanks. I'd just like to continue a bit the discussion about whether people are philosophers or not. Sorry, but here I really have to join our colleague Ben Fountain on this in saying that I think it may be true in response to Paul Krugman that people will provide certain kinds of answers that may seem simple, but I think this is an artifact of our methodology as political scientists. That is to say, they may or may not be familiar with the shibboleths of academic discourse, but if one methodologically takes the time to become immersed in people's life worlds and have longer conversations with them, then we do find out that people actually have very elaborate ideas about why it is that they do what they do, and that survey research, you know, does produce the kinds of answers that lead us to the kinds of elitism that we get accused of as academics very often.
I want to add something before I turn to Jeffrey Isaac. This is direct response. You can speak now. No.
I just want to reinforce what Jessica just said. So the Bartels and Aitken book, Democracy for Realists, I don't know if you were alluding to that, Paul Krugman, from what you were talking about, but Kathy Kramer's book, which has gotten a lot of attention on rural resentment in Wisconsin, is, I think, linked to a very different methodological approach. She published an article in the journal Perspectives on Politics in 2017 on precisely this issue that I highly recommend.
Yeah. Good. I actually want to change the topic abruptly, but I want to ask the panel as a whole about looking at the issue of inequality in a global perspective. And I want to ask you to think a bit about globalization along the following lines. As someone who came up as a participant in the New Left of the 60s, the gospel I was taught about a free market economy extending around the world is that the world's poorer countries would remain mired in poverty. 40 years later, that's not the way the world looks. So there's this very large and big fact that there are a host of newly developed and developing countries around the world, even in Africa. How this is related to inequality, it seems to me, I'm struck when I look at the statistics that globally, inequality is decreasing. But within advanced industrial countries, inequality is growing. And in a certain sense, it seems like willy-nilly there's been a kind of happening in slow motion, a global redistribution of wealth that has created in the developed countries a kind of crisis and an undermining of a kind of egalitarian working premise that had been in effect for 60 or 70 years. Now, maybe my intuition of this is completely wrong, but I would be curious about when you, look worldwide and how these global tendencies impact on national sovereign states. How do you think about that?
That sounds like me. Although I wish if we only had a Woody Allen, allowed to do Woody Allen movies. This is a terrible person, by the way. But I wish I had my colleague Branko Milanovic to pull out here. But if people know about the elephant curve, so Branko did this amazing thing where he took together, basically looked at individual percentiles of individual income worldwide and growth rates over the period since the late 1980s. And what it looks like is that there's a tail, which is the global super elite, which is pulling away from everybody else. But there's also a huge hump in the middle, which is the developing country middle class, but particularly China. But it's not just China. And that's been a miraculous improvement in the standard of living for probably well over 1 billion people there in that other hump. But then there's this tail at the right end that's also doing very well. And in between, at one end is the left behind. Still a lot of Africa is still not touched by any of this. And then there's a valley of despair, which is the working class in the advanced countries. And so that's the story. If you ask, is global inequality rising or falling, the real answer is yes. It's not a one-dimensional story. Now, the question is, how much is that causal? How much of the travails of the working class in advanced countries are a necessary consequence of the rise of developing countries? And that's where we can have genuine arguments about it. And I would say on balance, the answer is not that much, that a large part of that takeoff of the elite in the advanced countries is specific to political choices made in the advanced countries. And you can see that partly by the fact that although inequality has risen a bit throughout the OECD, it's very differential. What's happened in the United States is not at all matched by what's happened elsewhere. So, Denmark is as exposed to globalization as we are, but they aren't experiencing the same destiny. But that's where the interesting issues lie.
Sort of more of a question than a comment, but yes, that's true, but median household incomes and average individual incomes are still dramatically lower in these countries than it is in the United States. I mean, someone on this panel knows, I'm sure, the median household income in China. I do not, but it's a fraction of the United States, right? I mean, there are many countries that have a better Gini coefficient than the United States, but the Gini coefficient isn't isn't everything if the wages are, close to penurious.
So, maybe this just connects to what's going to get covered in the next panel. That, it seems important to note that that we're dealing with various kinds of migration patterns that are clearly the product of persistent and sustained structural inequalities between the global north and the global south, that have persisted regardless of kind of like the large scale shifts that were just noted, and that are also the product, this is what Paul just said, of a set of economic choices made within the global north about how to organize and manage the global economy, and that you can connect to the Washington Consensus, to privatization, to quote unquote neoliberalism, whatever the phrase or term that you want to use, but are obviously the product, at least in part, of market liberalization and the ways in which market liberalization has just wrought huge amounts of suffering both globally and domestically, and then created all of these pressures that are understood in the US as, why is it all of a sudden people just appear at the border, rather than these are part of long-term dynamics that, are at least partially causally related to choices in the center.
So I want to sharpen the question because to me, it's a policy question, and the European Union, of course, was created as a free trading bloc. But one of its pillars was the free movement of people, labor mobility. And the founders thought of this as a package deal, free movement of goods, services, ideas, and people. And obviously that plays a role in equalizing incomes throughout the European Union. You look at the number of Poles who work in England, say, and send remittances back to Poland. It's a substantial inflow of income because of this mobility. So lurking behind my question is a policy question about what should be the policy of globalization, because we have a president who's anti-globalizing. In a certain sense, I think one of the cosmic jokes of recent political history is if you go back to the battle in Seattle and the people who wanted to destroy the WTO, the World Trade Organization, their wishes come true. Donald Trump is delivering. However, they didn't anticipate that besides protectionism and destroying, international trade agreements, he would want to shut down labor mobility and migration. So, the puzzle to me, and in a way, I would love to hear Paul talk a little bit more about it, because I don't know the European cases all that well, is to what extent the European idea that this is a package deal, that the mobility of capital and labor in some sense ought to go together and do go together, and can they be decoupled, and if so, how? And it's a question also, to put it narrowly, about protectionism as a trade policy.
I really don't want this to be me giving a seminar, but no, first of all, trade and migration are not equivalent. In some models they are, but they aren't in reality, and so it makes a big difference. Let me say that this is where I think there is a genuine issue. My general view on this is if you don't feel somewhat conflicted about immigration policy, then there's something wrong with you. And the reason is a lot of it has to do. It's not so much that workers from poor countries come in and depress wages, because there's a fair bit of evidence now that says that actually Central American immigrants to the United States are not close substitutes for domestic-born workers. It's not actually that big of a deal, but they are claimants. Unless we really have a kind of segmented society, they're claimants on the benefits. And if you want a strong welfare state, then the question is for whom? And there's a cosmopolitan welfare function that says it should be available to everybody on the planet equally, but try selling that politically. So in practice, you have some kind of trade-off between the notion that people trying to come to advanced countries from poorer countries are basically just like your own grandparents, But on the other hand, that a generous welfare state is not going to be sustainable with completely open borders. And where the compromise lies is a problem. Now, Europe was not originally free movement of people. The European Union didn't, that's a 1992, that's the Single European Act, and it's a kind of, it was a little bit careless. They did the Single European Act and the Eastern Extension at the same time. So they simultaneously brought in a bunch of countries with much lower per capita GDP than the original members and gave free movement of people. Now, even so, it's not that, it's an exaggerated issue. You know, the Brexit rhetoric was way overheated on that. But it is an issue, and of course, imagine extending, imagine taking North Africa into the European Union. Not going to happen.
So I think this tension, this difference between the free movement of people and of goods is actually a very important dynamic for understanding the nature of the populism we see around the world now. If you step back from Brexit and look at what's actually going on in British politics around it, I think there's a strong desire to end the free movement of people into the UK without ending free trade. And that's the impossible situation in which Theresa May finds herself now. And it's impossible because those things were tied together in the logic of the EU in the 90s, but they don't seem like they're the same thing to a lot of British voters. And there's enormous concern about open immigration, while there's not only not enormous concern about free trade, but there's a desire to retain Britain's access to the other European economies. I think there's something like that in American populism that's a little obscured by the fact that President Trump himself is very much obsessed with trade, and always has been. Well, there's energy behind his immigration views on the right, and there's not around his trade views. That's almost just him. And I think it's hard to see that because of the nature of the degree to which our politics is all about Donald Trump right now. But the trade issue and the immigration issue are just not the same issue in the populist politics of a lot of Western countries.
I just wanted to repeat a line. It's an old story, but back in the 60s and 70s, Switzerland had a huge labor force, most from within the EU, but it was mostly Southern Italian workers. And Max Frisch wrote this wonderful line. This was if you ever saw the movie Bread and Chocolate, that's what that was all about. And his wonderful line was, "We wanted labor, but human beings came."
I'd like to turn to Aziz, Alex, and then
very quickly, one, I mean, I still think that we should question the fiction that the EU is a space for the free movement of labor. I mean, that's something that would be laughable if we were speaking from North or West Africa, that part of the condition for the free movement within Europe is essentially maintaining a kind of policing function where you have communities that are trapped within police states in other parts of the world. So one, and then two, on kind of Trumpian Republican heterodoxy on trade, I think it's also really useful to highlight that the version of protectionism is all about pitting particular members of a global working class against each other. It's not actually about challenging the prerogatives of capital at all. So what Trump wants is a kind of trade system that unleashes capital's mobility while constraining the movement of labor precisely so that you can kind of racialize the terms of who counts as a member of the working class that would get the benefits of particular kinds of social programs. And so, it seems like that's exactly the puzzle that has to be kind of confronted. How do you instead actually have a set of policies that are in the service of a global working class while constraining the prerogatives of capital?
So I have Alex, Federico, and Bill Galston.
Yeah, just on the movement part. So there's a complicated story, it seems to me, on free movement. There really is a great deal more free movement in the world regionally than before. So you have 500 million people in the EU. Africa is negotiating now, the African Union is negotiating a free movement convention for the African continent. And the rise of dual nationality around the world has actually allowed people with 2 passports. That's a huge change in the last 20 years, the numbers of people who hold dual nationality and can go into 2 countries. But I wouldn't, so the migration happening in the world, which actually has stayed constant as a percentage of world population for the last 20 or 30 years. Less than 5% of the world's population are considered migrants, which is interesting. So we think this is a huge increase. As a percentage, it has not increased for a long time. But the south-north migration here is only a third of the movement. South-south migration equals south-north migration, as does north-north migration. And they all have different kinds of parameters. So we shouldn't think this is all a story of the south coming to the north. It's just one flow. As to the U.S. story, Trump has supported the so-called RAISE Act, which was proposed by Senator Tom Cotton and another senator, which fundamentally shifts the American system, which is overwhelmingly family-based, to a skills-based system. So we hand out 1 million green cards a year. We're so focused on the wall, we think that immigration is shut down. There's been no threat to that. More than 1 million green cards the last 3 or 4 years. It's a huge number. Most of that is family-based, and the move on the right now is to shift that to skills-based, which is consistent with actually increasing the flow of labor so long as it's skilled labor. And I think there are 2 parts to that. One is the economic part, let's take people who help us. But secondly, there's a race element to that. When you cut down on family migration and move to skilled migration, you're choosing unfavored race, you're suppressing a movement of unfavored races, and favored races would come in. And I think you really can't get rid of the race element in the economic story.
Yes, I would like to add to the race element the other element, which is racism, which is to say that you establish, or they establish, a hierarchy among races, and in a way, this then leads to very irrational policies. I mean, policies which are not related to material interests, but rather to ideological drives. I would like to return to one issue that Jim said, I mean, about these anti-globalists, because it's very peculiar that you have a bunch now, and this is not new at all. This started with the Mussolini's Fascist International, and then Perón tried the same, and then Chavez tried the same. And then you have, this is new in populism at all, that you have these now anti-globalists that they are establishing a global international of anti-globalists. So this is a populist, illiberal attempt, to really put down liberal democracies. And you see this in Bolsonaro, in Trump, in Salvini, and others that actually claim to have an international bond. So, and again, this is not new. I mean, in fascism, you have the first Fascist International, which was an international of radical nationalists. And it might seem irrational to us, or even a contradiction to us, but it's not. Which leads me to my second point, which is that populism is not really driven, in my view, by material interest or economic imperatives. Actually, it is highly ideological. It is an ideological understanding of democracy as anti-liberal. And because of that, in the latest chapter, you have racism driving policy. So I think this is important because at the end of the day, when you read someone like Salvini, Salvini is not interested in, cutting down European immigration, but he's really interested in establishing racist guidelines for immigration in Europe, and you see this in other European countries. So,
I suggest that I have in the order here Bill and Sophia, and that we're already lapping into the issue and theme of the next panel, which is on migration, immigration, and race. And that we hear from Bill and Sophia, maybe take a couple of questions and then break and reconvene. So if that's agreeable, Bill?
Actually, Jim, because my remarks were going to follow up on some immigration and trade themes, perhaps delaying them until the next panel would be the right thing to do.
Okay, then actually that's not a bad segue for what I really wanted to say, which is I found this conversation interesting in its drift in some ways, that you started us off with the idea that equality was going to be a kind of central category, and in fact, there's been almost no conversation about equality. There's been a fair amount of conversation about inequality or inegalitarianism of various kinds, but not about any vision of equality of any sort. And in some ways, I'm not sure I agree with Yuval Levin, who said, I think, in the beginning that equality is central to the political vocabulary of sort of all sides these days. In fact, I think what's striking is how little equality actually is on the table these days, right or left, that it's not an operative word. It's not just that the vocabulary of Trump is in some ways really devoid of the sacred words of American politics, or of democratic politics largely. It doesn't talk much about liberty or equality, things that usually presidents, right or left, love to invoke. But I think equality is oddly a word with almost no meaning these days. So we do talk about inequality, and this conversation moved quickly to global inequalities and that sort of thing. But I would be interested to hear anybody offer a kind of substantive account of what equality actually is in our present world, or whether it's really the part of democracy that's been left behind.
Happy to. Yeah, so the thing that to me seems to be really interesting is that I think that there's maybe I can speak about this from like a politically situated left. I mean, and this was a bit of where I was coming from in my opening comments, that there's a strange fact about the language of egalitarianism, which is precisely how it seems to be so malleable that it's actually been employed in lots of different ways as a method of like contesting the capacity of oppressed groups to actually exercise political power. So you see this in, for example, invocations of religious liberty in the context of whether or not you can deny a gay couple service at your business. I mean, that the argument that's being presented is an argument about a kind of egalitarianism, that it's like actually affecting the capacity of like the business owner to be able to pursue their own rights. You see this in the critique of affirmative action, that affirmative action is itself a form of reverse discrimination. You see it in the discussion of voting rights, and in part because of how it's not clearly that like the progressive project is a project on behalf of equality against hierarchy, because of how hierarchy is so malleably using the language of equality, that the shift has basically been to a defense of democracy, which is something that is, I think, like subtly different. There's obviously a relationship between democracy and equality, but the argument is basically, how do you create institutions that ensure that everybody actually has the capacity to engage in equal and effective freedom, freedom understood as some degree of self-rule over all of the primary conditions of collective life, over economic decision-making, political decision-making, etc. And that's actually been a ground that feels like it's stronger ground precisely because of the degree to which the institutions of collective life are themselves, so fundamentally unequal, or, that they're so fundamentally organized around counter-majoritarian principles. So you can defend democracy in the face of like the counter-majoritarian problems of the constitutional system, from the Senate to the Supreme Court to the the Electoral College, in the face of like the hierarchies of like corporate prerogatives and like the way that the economy is structured, and that feels like a much more powerful way to essentially make arguments that might previously have been pitched in straightforward equality terms.
So what I see is Roger Smith, and I see Teresa, and I see Yuval, and then we're done with us, and we'll hear from the audience.
My response to Sophia's excellent point is in the same general vein as Aziz, but I want to remind us that there was a time when we used to hear lots of debates about equality of opportunity versus equality of results, so everyone would talk about equality. That debate sort of petered out because it turned out that nobody was really for total equality of results, and the notion of equality of opportunity was very complicated and actually pushed in a more radical direction than people wanted. But as Aziz noted, we still get arguments about equality now often in the context of whether we really maximize opportunities for all by some kinds of special treatment, like race-based affirmative action, sometimes religious accommodations, and the people who oppose those will say this violates equality, you're not treating people identically. The people who favor those say this actually moves us toward equality by creating conditions in which everybody has a meaningful opportunity to flourish. But that still doesn't mean that equality language dominates those debates, because unfortunately they quickly turn into an argument over which side is racist, which side is bigoted, and we get lots of discourse about charges of racism and bigotry that don't help us move us forward toward any form of equality.
I guess I wasn't clear, Sophia. The welfare state, a big part of it was creating institutions, protecting institutions that gave a countervailing force against those forces that would create inequality, and that's a labor movement. It's hard to imagine a democracy without a vibrant democratic labor movement, and we don't have one, except in the government sector. And so this Treaty of Detroit was about those collective institutions and there's lots of spillover effects from a labor movement. There's a collective bargaining agreement, but there's also voting engagement. If you want people to vote, make them into a union member. That's the most important variable describing whether or not people will vote. And so I don't know how we can have a conversation about equality or democracy or liberalism without talking about the strength of workers and their political and economic engagement.
So I very much appreciate the point that Sophia makes, and I would say, in a sense, by starting out with the breadth of how Lincoln talked about equality, I wanted to suggest that that's so broad as to encompass everything, and in that sense, it's hard to actually talk about equality, but it is worth seeing that the kinds of arguments that might be put in a straightforward way as arguments for popular sovereignty, or as arguments for protection of minorities, or as arguments for equal protection of the laws, are very often in American politics understood and argued as arguments from the premise of equality, which starts them in a kind of common premise. The Declaration of Independence lays out that premise as an argument basically for popular sovereignty. Right, if you think about the logic of that argument. But the same argument the same premise can also serve as a premise for equal protection, which is something very different from popular sovereignty. It actually is how we place limits on the powers of majorities. So now when people argue for majoritarianism, when we say we're so frustrated with how the Senate is structured, that the people who win a majority of the vote don't actually get to govern, that's an argument from equality too. It's an argument for one person, one vote. But the argument against is also an argument from equality. It's an argument for the protection of minorities. And so you might say, that's just frustrating. Why do we not just drop this? But I think it does something very important for us. It helps to keep our politics within the 40-yard lines. American politics have tended to be more moderate version of European politics and of the politics of other societies. We've had many of the same problems, but a lot of times we have not had the same kind of extremism in our politics. Not always. We've certainly had extremism. But it has helped a little in keeping us from going as far as we might by forcing everybody involved to at least pretend that what they're talking about is equality. And that, even when it's pretending, that can be a valuable way to constrain the extremes of our politics.
Questions. We have time for one or two questions. I see already 3 hands up. Okay. So you guys call out.
There's a lady up there.
Yeah, okay. And you're going to have to speak loudly.
Yes, you. Yes, please.
Am I allowed to share a few comments?
Yeah.
Yes.
May I come up?
May she
Yeah,
come?
just so I can be heard?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Those microphones, you know.
May I?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Good morning. And respected moderators, sirs, mesdames, and the new school. I'm an educator and I'm no academic or expert on political science, but I just had a few thoughts which I would like to share. I'm sorry. The first thing that I wanted to mention was regarding, with all due respect, the Constitution of America, the tenets of equality. All men should be considered equal, and also the tenets of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To qualify them more, to make it more clear, I believe, if it were to be paraphrased, not exactly, but equality as being paraphrased to a stable community with the pursuit of social justice. This, I think, does justice to the fact that even though the concept that people are born equal innately, but due to proclivity, predicament, personal premise, or philosophy, everyone does not attain their full ability. It is not in terms of a condemnation or discrimination, but the fact that the best way to achieve, in my opinion, a stable community would be to pursue social justice in terms of skills, expertise, education, etc. In terms of stable community, I also wanted to mention that the wheels of a stable community would be the economic and education. The reason I mention education is because, as we were mentioning, forgive me if I'm a little patchy in my speech, but the reason I mention is the immigration aspect, or the immigration factoring into this discussion. Subordination exists as long as there it will be more towards immigration populations and demographics, but once we have, which is a long way off, a kind of a stable society, it could be even within a country, which couldn't be so far off, we have to deal with what really is stability, and that would be in terms, once again, social justice. When we respect that, we create a tiered society according to skill and education. And the best.
Thank you. We have to actually take another question.
Just one sentence more,
okay.
sir.
Yep.
The best way I can corroborate it is with the good book, the Bible, which says that which is more towards, in terms of the parable of the talents, that social justice is a big consideration in creating a community. Thank you very much for your time.
So, somebody else do the question. You do it. Do it. You do it.
Please, yes.
I think this is great. I want to come back to what you've all said at the end, but I thought the welfare state that Teresa was talking about is sort of quality of condition broadly, right? You want to redistribute stuff out. But then I thought the points about the majoritarian democracies can work the other way, right? So both the discussion about how you prevent majoritarian democracies from eroding individual rights and behaviors, whether the ones we like personally or not, and then how do you also present them from seizing control, I love the reference to Peronism, of the state apparatus, so the welfare state is then meant to pay off for certain groups, but not others. Is there a tension between the welfare state and this majoritarianism, or this racist majoritarianism?
So we can take one more question. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Where?
Oh.
Who's wrecking? Yeah.
Hello, and thank you very much. Thanks. It's been such a wonderful discussion. I'd like to make 2 comments and give some food for thought. And if during the day anyone feels that they want to talk to this, I would be so happy. So the first food for thought is addressed to Sophia, and that is my perception of equality is really the absence of inequality. In terms of some other things that we haven't discussed, saying this very politely, I'm hoping that in a future panel we do have a little bit more diversity. I say that very respectfully. I love everyone here. But here's the second comment I wanted to make. I think it's a shame to exclude the philosophies and experiences of some foreign-born people, and I'm not talking about us excluding it here, I'm just saying in general here in the States. For instance, the experiences of the African diaspora in America, often educated and middle class in the US, perhaps fled some political strife back home, but virtually unrepresented in American society and quite separate from American-born African Americans. Some of these Africans are often from intricate societies that are trying to break away from dictatorships, autocracy, and move towards democracy. I would love to hear an African panelist add to this discussion. Thank you.
Okay, one more question. You've been trying, I've been pointing. Speak. No, up there at the top. Yeah, her.
It came to me because particularly the case of Hungary, where you have a case of supposed illiberal democracy. And the question is really, is liberalism, and I'm not really talking about the economic order of liberalism, I'm really speaking about toleration, autonomy, and dominant elections of liberalism theoretically. So is liberalism separable from democracy?
That was last night's theme. I wish you would have come. And I think you have to read Jim's book and my book, because yes. If you look historically, liberalism and democracy are two separate traditions. That's what we argue in our books. Democracy is, of course, an ancient ideal, goes back to Greece, and liberalism was really invented as a result of the French Revolution. So they are separable.
And they can converge, but then how? They can converge, but then the question is how. And I think many of us share an interest in the future of liberal democracies. Not all of us agree that the true traditions are as separable as Helena and I have claimed.
Just to say, I think the question would be if and when the Hungarian majority decides to get rid of Fidesz, we'll discover whether it's a democracy or not. I suspect not in practice.
Yeah. So on that note, I suggest we take a break and we'll reconvene. We'll reshuffle the people at the front and we'll continue the conversation.